Well, I do research on small farms for the most part, and how I ended up doing that traces all the way back to when I was an undergraduate, and for a variety of reasons ended up deciding I wanted to major in anthropology, and went to an archaeological field school while I was an undergraduate, and had been out on an archaeological site for about 6 hours before I knew that it not only was what I wanted to keep studying, but that it was what I wanted to do professionally. And so I was doing archaeology in an area where they were very interested in the relationship between how people farmed, how ancient farming worked, and their settlement patterns. And I ended up a few years later in graduate school thinking that I wanted to be an archaeologist who specialized in settlement patterns. But the farming part was always there in the back of my mind, and I was at graduate school at the University of Arizona, and there was a well-known anthropologist there by the name of Bob Netting, who was one of the leading thinkers and scholars on the topic of small farms and how they worked, and had done really interesting and important work among farmers in Africa, basically looking at what we now would call sustainable farming and what actually makes it tick. And so at the same time that I was pursuing archaeological studies, I started a collaboration with Bob Netting where I was helping him reanalyze some of his data from Africa. And we found that we had a lot of the same interests, and I found that he was a really interesting person to talk with. And at the same time, I was becoming disenchanted with my ability to answer the sorts of questions I wanted to answer as an archaeologist. And one day he proposed that we work together and do a restudy going back to the same group in Nigeria and see how life had changed for them since he'd been there back in the 1960s. And my girlfriend at the time, later wife, Priscilla Stone, was also very interested in working in Africa. So the three of us put together a collaborative project. And it was, a lot of it had to do with how agriculture had changed since Bob had been there back in the 1960s. I still thought of myself mainly as an archaeologist. But we completed that study, and I became really intrigued by how the farming worked there among this group of people who were called the Kofyar. And when I came back, I wrote a dissertation and started work on the faculty at Columbia as an archaeologist who was both working on settlement patterns and also with a specialty in small farms. So I'd done research on small farms for several years. And then if we jump ahead in time, we get to 1994. And I had just come back from more research in Nigeria and was writing an article about population and small farming and conflict. And I remember taking a break from my work to walk down Broadway, and I went into a greengrocer's there and saw something called a Flavor Saver tomato being sold, and it was advertised as a genetically modified tomato. And I didn't have a clue what to make of that, and I remember being scientific about it and buying a genetically modified tomato and also a regular tomato and bringing them back to the apartment and slicing them up and doing a taste comparison and thinking there wasn't that much difference, and then not thinking much more about it for a while. But that was the beginning of genetically modified foods and crops. That was the first genetically modified food that had ever been sold in the U.S. And what happened in the years following that was that more and more genetically modified crops were produced and more genetically modified foods were being sold. And by 1996, genetically modified foods were coming into the European markets. And by 1997, there was a big backlash against them, where the the market sort of, the bottom dropped out of the market for genetically modified foods. And by 99, the companies that were involved with these, which it includes Monsanto was the dominant one, but several others as well, realized they had a major problem. And they took a step back and regrouped and said, how are we going to rethink how to sell these products? And so by 99 and 2000, this whole narrative started to emerge that had to do with the third world, and it had to do with these crops are really, or these foods are really what is needed to feed the third world. And this led to just a huge brouhaha that was played out in the academic literature and on television and in the press and in paid-for media by public relations companies. And people were going back and forth arguing that no, these new crops actually are endangering people in developing countries. They're not needed to feed people. They're not tested. They're not safe. They're leading to corporate control over food. Versus the other side arguing that no, this is science. This is progress. These are technologies that can make safer foods and more productive foods, and so on and so forth. There was a lot being written about this by 99, 2000. And I couldn't help but notice that the overwhelming majority of what was being written was coming either from companies that had a vested interest in it, or was coming from activists who also had a vested interest in it. And basically there were a lot of claims being made about how these technologies would affect farmers and would affect the consuming public. And there was almost no role in the debates for people who actually studied those things. So I actually studied small farms, which were one of the big things that kept coming up in these debates. So in about 1999, I shelved, or I mothballed the research that I was doing at the time and said, I have to get involved in this. There's a real opening here for people that actually do research on small farms. And so I got a grant, and in 2000 I was able to take time off from work at the university. I had moved to Washington University before this. And I was able to work in a biotech lab to try to get some sort of firsthand experience and knowledge of the way the whole process worked. And also started looking at developing countries where genetically modified foods and crops were either available or looked like they were going to be available before long. And India turned out to be far and away the most interesting place to me, where there seemed to be a need for some genetically modified crops there. And at the same time, there was a very active NGO sector, that is a green activist sector, who was all geared up to fight genetically modified crops. And India had just a little bit of everything, and it seemed to me to be the most important battle line in this whole dispute. So I actually started doing field work there in 2000, and there were no GM crops available there yet, but they were being tested. And I've been going back every year since 2000 and studying the cotton farmers there. Cotton was the first GM crop that was going to be released there. And so I was there for 2 years before the GM cotton became available. And then in 2002, GM cotton became available. And over the next several years, it grew very slowly in popularity. And by about 2005, it was starting to become very popular. And it now is completely dominant in the whole cotton sector there. So that's how I ended up studying the genetically modified crops, and that's a continuing area of research for me. But at the same time, I've maintained an interest in small farms in America, and so the other research interest that I'm developing now has to do with a startup research project that has to do with a whole new wave of small farmers in America. Sustainable farmers, organic, local marketed, humanely raised, pastured, direct marketed, so on and so forth. So it all has to do with farms, and it seems to all have to do with small farms. I'm not interested in big industrial agriculture so much, and that's how I got to do it.
I'm interested very much in the anthropology department at Columbia, and maybe to a larger extent the anthropology departments at decent-sized universities. You were mentioning that there wasn't room in the debate at a certain point for people who are actually studying small farms in Africa or small farms in India. The debate was being dominated by folks without that expertise. I'm wondering if you felt pressure from the huge economic interests engaged here as you began to enter this area with the expertise you had. I'm wondering how true it is that a place like Columbia or Washington University can insulate itself from Monsanto power.
Well, it's an interesting question. I had actually left Columbia by the time I started doing research on biotech. But Washington University actually is a more interesting case study in terms of that question, because Washington University is the university that played a more key role than any other university I can think of in the development of genetically modified crops. It was at WashU that the original, some critical early work was done on trying to figure out how do you genetically modify a plant, which turns out to be done very differently than the early genetic modification, which was done on bacteria. And it was also scholars, biologists at Washington University that did some key original work on figuring out how Bt genes work. And Bt is it's a soil bacterium that's got genes that can be put into plants to make the plants pesticidal. So there were two key bodies of research that were done in the early days of biotech. And I don't know of any other university that's played such a key role in it. That's in the origins of it. And since then, Washington University has continued to have very close relationships with Monsanto. And a lot of the biologists at Washington University are in Monsanto Hall. And there's a research fund there called the Monsanto Fund, where the money comes from Monsanto and it goes towards sponsoring research that is of interest to Monsanto. And on one hand, it's true that universities have long had financial entanglements with the corporate sector. And I'm sure that if my friends from Monsanto were here now, they would say there's really nothing new about this. Universities need money from the corporate sector, and one of the things that the universities are supposed to be doing is benefiting industry as well as society at large. So it's true that it's not new. Some scholars, however, have looked at it and have said, well, the level of entanglements, the level of corporate entanglements has really gone up over the years. And furthermore, that biotech has been a key part of this. And I think there's something to that argument. And there are a lot of reasons why that would be true, but one of them has to do with patents. When people started genetically modifying crops, or genetically modifying organisms in general, it ended up playing a key role in changes in patent law. And so patents are now awarded on genes, or technically on the use of genes in biotechnological inventions. And the majority of these patents are held by companies. And Monsanto has got a very large and lucrative portfolio of these patents. And so in order for researchers to be able to use those genes, they have to be able to get permission from Monsanto. So this gives, and it's not just Monsanto, it's a lot of biotech companies. So this gives them a new way of influencing the sort of research that gets done. And so this has been pointed out by a number of scholars, and I think it's quite true. So it's hard for WashU and anybody to insulate themselves from that sort of influence, because there are companies that control the intellectual property that you need to have access to in order to do your research. Then there are issues of funding, and I think it's quite true that over the years, universities have tended to need more and more money from outside and from the corporate sector. And so what kind of corporations want to fund a university? Well, different corporations have got different reasons for it, but particularly with biotech, it tends to be lucrative for companies to fund research, because so much of what drives biotech is innovation and basic research. It's a very research-intensive field, and so universities are in the research business. And so I think the economics of it make for new emphasis on universities seeking funding from companies like biotech companies. So there's two ways that all these companies are, that all universities find it somewhat hard to insulate, all research universities find it hard to insulate themselves from those sort of corporate influences.
Do you feel that pressure in the work you do?
It hasn't had much impact on me. If I were a biologist, I would say, yeah, the corporate interests do affect what I can and can't work on, and so on. I have felt relatively free to do the sort of research that I want to do. On the other hand, most people like me, social scientists, we're not going to have findings one way or the other that would be of that much interest to the biotech industry. So they're not inclined to fund us. And it's not especially likely that we would be publishing things that they would find especially annoying or embarrassing. Although there have been some scholars who have written things that have been annoying and embarrassing to the biotech industry, and I suspect that they have felt some pressure, but I haven't felt any at all.
Well, one thing you could conclude, I have no idea what your research shows about India, but one thing that research could show is that genetically modified cotton makes the rich richer and the poor poorer, and doesn't, on balance, do much good for the community that it's introduced to. And if the battle that the companies are fighting is a battle for the hearts and minds of the public, not a battle on economic terms, but a larger battle against people who said, I don't want weird food that comes from some demon lab in my mouth. I don't want human beings messing around with the fundamental programming of living beings. I mean, if the objection is at that level, the response is, but look at the response, but look at all these hungry people, look at all these economically disadvantaged people whom we can help if we just make these changes, reference the Green Revolution to make the point. And, you know, point is, if that's the line of the public relations campaign, any loud voice that says that's not what's happening is a pretty substantial roadblock, right?
It could be a substantial roadblock. I think what a biotech company would do is if a social scientist was coming up with those sorts of findings, rather than putting pressure on them directly and trying to keep them from doing their research, which would be really hard to do. There's no direct route for them to do that. A more likely way for them to respond would be to try to marginalize or to cast doubt on that person's research. And there's a long history of companies being able to cast doubt on research that is embarrassing to them. And of course, the classic case study in this is the tobacco industry, which for years managed to turn absolutely indisputable evidence of the ill health effects of smoking into a question. You know, some people think it does, and some people think it doesn't, and so there's a famous phrase that came out of all that saying, "Doubt is our business," or "Doubt is our product." So they can create doubt. So I think that if I were to tomorrow find that actually GM cotton in India is, as you say, making the rich richer, making the poor poorer, it's actually an economic disaster, it's not solving agronomic problems, and if this were to be published in some high-profile place, what I would expect the biotech industry to do would be to simply cast doubt about it. And there are all sorts of ways that one can cast doubt about that. And one of the things that they could do, for instance, which has got some validity, would be to point out that, hey, all sorts of crazy claims are made about GMOs. And you can't believe everything you hear. And if they made that claim, I'd be inclined to agree with them on the biotech side of things. There are claims in India that are made on a regular basis that not only aren't true, they simply couldn't be true. The classic one, the most hotly contested one, year in and year out, is the argument that has to do with suicides. Because India has got a really tragic problem with farmer suicides. And the argument is made routinely by some scholars, by lots of activists, all the way up to Prince Charles has opined on this. Not that he is exactly an expert on biotech or causes of suicide, but the argument is made over and over again that it is the failure of this genetically modified cotton, this BT cotton, that is leading to all the farmer suicides in India. And just the historical fact of the matter is that the biggest spike in suicide, farmer suicides, by far was in 1998 in Andhra Pradesh, which is the state where I work. And that was 4 years before the biotech. That was 98, 99, 2000. Yeah, 2002 was when the GM cotton was first released. So it simply couldn't have been the cause of it. And furthermore, since then, the data do not show that in general there has been more failure of cotton crops. Some cotton crops do fail, but some cotton crops failed before BT cotton came along. So, you know, the biotech industry can legitimately say lots of crazy. Oh, the other claim that comes out of Andhra Pradesh a lot is that these farmers' sheep are dying because they're going into the fields after they've harvested the cotton and they're grazing on the stubble, the cotton stubble, and there's something in it that's poisoning the sheep. And I don't know of any way that that could possibly be happening, and I haven't seen any evidence that actually suggests that it's true, but it's a claim that's made. So I'm not in the business of telling Monsanto what to do, but if Monsanto were in that position, what I would advise them to do, and I think quite certainly what they would do, is they would try to marginalize embarrassing findings by saying all sorts of crazy claims are being made.
And it sounds like the corollary to that is the people who make crazy, unsubstantiated, all over the map claims are essentially doing the business of the large food producers' public relations firm in diluting anything scholarly that might be said in a critical direction.
Yeah, I think there's some truth in that. An example of that is that when when BT cotton first started to be tested in India, the story that was coming out of the activists at that time was, beware of this stuff, these crops are Terminator crops. And Terminator was the nickname given to a technology developed by a cottonseed company, actually originally developed by the USDA, but co-patented with a cottonseed company in Louisiana, that would make, if it worked, it would make seeds that couldn't be replanted. The farmer could buy the seed, they could plant it, they would get a crop, but the seeds could only be sold, they couldn't be replanted. So this struck a lot of people as a very offensive use of biotech and sort of an anti-farmer technology. So the technology really was patented, and it was out there, although it hadn't been commercialized. And people were mobilized in India. They were out having marches against these new Terminator crops. But they weren't Terminator crops. In fact, there's still, to this day, there are no Terminator crops. It is just an experimental technology. There are no Terminator plants anywhere except probably in a greenhouse in Louisiana. So it's exactly what you're saying. This ended up being a public relations boon for the biotech companies, who then had ads in newspapers in Delhi saying, look at the stuff that the activists are saying about us, it's just wrong. And if anybody was to take the trouble to look into it, they would find out, yeah, it is wrong. So in some ways they do actually benefit the, biotech companies. But there are big audiences out there that will want to believe those claims regardless of what the evidence says. So you're always going to have, there remains some constituency for these claims despite the lack of anything to back them up.
So what's the truth here, and how close are you to having it? I mean, to the initial question you ran into when you picked up that tomato and wondered, well, what is this thing? And then later, is this in fact good for the communities it gets introduced to? Is it in fact the salvation of third world countries? Where do you stand on those questions now?
Well, there's a lot of different answers to that. I think a lot of it, I tend not to want to talk about things being good or bad in general. I tend to think of them, are they good for a particular party or for particular interests? So I think biotech is good for a lot of interests, especially in the US. It obviously is good for the biotech sector. It's great for intellectual property lawyers. It's very good for a lot of universities because it gives new grounds for corporations wanting to sponsor a lot of research there. It is good for where I live now in St. Louis in particular, because St. Louis is one of the cities that's trying to position itself as a leader in biotech development. It's good for my university because we've got especially close ties with the biotech sector. So there are a bunch of winners there, and I don't want to completely write those off. In terms of the specific claims about, also in terms of farmers, there are some benefits here for big commodity farmers. There's no doubt about it. If you can put in if you can put a Bt gene into a crop, chances are you can give it a way to fight off pests that couldn't have been done through conventional breeding. But in terms of these claims that have dominated the debate since the late 90s, the idea that this is going to be a key technology for feeding the third world and for helping third world farmers, I'm much more skeptical on that claim. I think there are a few projects underway with genetically modified crops that I think do stand to offer farmers unique benefits. And the one that I've written about and I still think is probably the most promising one is there's a project going on at the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center in St. Louis where they are working to make cassava not only resistant to viruses, but also biofortified, that is, having its nutritional content enhanced. And I think there are specific reasons that could be a very beneficial crop. Cassava is a great crop for the poor. It grows really well on poor soils. It's not really finicky in terms of its labor requirements. So if you're a poor farmer and somebody in your household's sick and you can't mobilize a lot of labor, you're probably not going to lose the crop. It's a multi-year crop. You can plant it one year and continue to harvest it. It can be used both for subsistence and for sale. So for a lot of reasons, it's a really good crop for the poor. And it does have some really severe problems. Nutritionally, it's quite poor, and it's being devastated by some viruses in Africa. And on top of that, it's a really tough crop to improve through conventional breeding. Now, it can be improved through conventional breeding, and sometimes people lose sight of the fact that genetic modification is not the only way to improve plants. There is something called breeding that's been going on for a long time, and it continues to go on. But with this particular crop, breeding is tough. So for a whole, oh, and the other thing that I think is very useful is cassava is a crop that reproduces vegetatively. So a farmer, it's not going to be end up under corporate control. A farmer can cut a twig off and give it to their neighbor, and they can plant that, and they can have a cassava plant. So that's an example of a place where I think genetic modification technologies really might have something good to offer. Now, they've been working on this for a long, long time, like over 15 years, and it has taken many millions of dollars, and it's still not clear when and if it will be available. So if it's a silver bullet, it hasn't really been put in the gun yet. But I think the point I'm making is I think it does have some promise. But in general, I tend to be pretty impatient with the general arguments that people are starving in the third world, therefore we need genetically modified crops. Because we've seen this over and over again that when people are hungry and malnourished in the third world, it is virtually never because there's not enough food. It's because they're too poor and they can't get the food. And this is so clear in India today. India has got more hungry people than any other country in the world by far. There's not even a close second. And India's, their buffer stocks of wheat and rice, they've got over 30 million tons beyond what they can even store in their buffer stocks, in the public buffer stocks. There's plenty of food in India. And so when people make the argument that we need GM crops to feed the third world because they're hungry in India, my question has to be, you've got to explain to me what GM crop is going to feed hungry Indians when 30 million tons of excess wheat and rice can't.
So, if the rationale of feeding hungry people, the poorest hungry people, is of only limited applicability, maybe with cassava, but not with certain other plants, then what social differences are being made by the introduction of genetically modified crops? If it isn't addressing the problem that people are claiming it's addressing, what is it doing to the social structures, to the way farming's done, and so forth?
Good question. I wish we knew more about it. I mean, that's what I've been trying to tackle in my research. But, and I can give you an answer to that in terms of what I've seen in India. But you have to remember that this issue changes depending on which crop you're talking about. Rice works differently than cotton. It changes depending on what area of the world you're talking about. Kansas and the Punjab are very different. It also varies through time. And so I would be very hesitant to generalize too far from what I've seen. But having said that, I have been trying to get at exactly that question in India. And I think I'd answer it this way, that the Indian cotton farmer was in big trouble even before BT cotton came along. And people have argued back and forth about what the problem was. And I've looked at this pretty closely for the last 10 years now. And I think the core problem, the most central problem they faced, was that this cotton seeds on the market, and they've got hybrid seeds, hybrid cotton in India, which means the farmers have to go back and buy it every year. So it's not one of these cases where the farmers can replant their own seed and develop their own locally adapted landrace. The seeds that the farmers were buying changed very quickly. Every year, there would be a whole new series of brands on the market. And they also were pretty unreliable. The cotton sector the seed sector is regulated very poorly, and a lot of seeds are mislabeled. And so due to this rapid change and due to this unrecognizability of the seeds, farmers were having an enormous amount of difficulty figuring out how the seeds worked and which seeds they had best use. In other words, there's sort of a normal process that farmers go through of adapting technologies to their farming system. And this has to be updated every year. And the whole process, what I call the skilling process of figuring out how that technology works on your farm, that process was broken down. And I've shown this with a long-term study of cottonseed choices. And I found that every village would have its own favorite, and the favorite would only last for about a year or so. Then much of the village would careen off to a new favorite and then to a new favorite. Meanwhile, the village right next to them, where they would have the same growing conditions, they would have a different favorite and they would careen off to their own different favorite. So the normal process of farmer decision making was badly disrupted. So BT cotton comes along, and its impact on in the field has been pretty variable. The activist claims that it's been a big failure are not very credible. In many cases, it's been a success. The biotech companies' claims, sometimes supported by economist research, that it's been just a smashing, remarkable success, are also overstated. It's actually been variable. But overall, it has certainly provided an added tool for farmers to help fight pests, which are a big problem with cotton. But what I'm concerned with is that at the cost of some added insect protection, what farmers have had to deal with is even more rapid change in the technology and even more unrecognizable technologies. When the BT cotton first came out, there was one genetic construct in it, and there are now 4 different genetic constructs. In other words, 4 different gene setups in the cotton. And none of the farmers that I've talked to really understand what the 4 different genes are all about. None of the vendors can explain what they're all about. And in fact, the scientists don't even know exactly how the 4 different gene constructs perform. And so I guess the bottom line here is that I think probably in general the farmers have accepted a tendency for the cotton to work a little bit better at the expense of an exacerbation of the underlying problem. And the underlying problem is that the technology is too unrecognizable, it's too opaque, and it's too rapidly changing.
So the effect of all this industrial engagement with Indian agriculture, it sounds like, is to undermine the sense that a farmer might have previously had that he or she knew what he or she was doing with crops and land. I think about my mother, who has a little truck garden. She's 87. She goes out every morning and shakes the bugs off the potatoes. I suppose you could genetically modify a potato to keep the bugs from eating it.
And they have.
With the number she has, even when she had a decent-sized field, back in the old days, she could go and shake the bugs off. And that worked. I suppose with small farms, there might be all sorts of fixes like that for getting around the problems that these genetic modifications are intended to also address.
Right.
So it isn't as if, I'm guessing it isn't as if a small farmer, somebody who can actually oversee the individual plants on his or her plot, is like defenseless without genetically modified products. A large farmer would be, though. Are we talking about pretty small farmers here?
In India, yes. Overwhelmingly small. And I think I would agree with you totally that one of the things that's endangered here is the farmer's sense that they know how to run their farm. And in some of the people who write on this, especially from the biotech industry, you get this sense that, well, the small farmer doesn't know what he's doing or what she's doing anyway, and so if we can come up with a technology that works automatically, then that's a win-win situation. But from my standpoint, that's sort of a win-lose situation. When you introduce a technology that seems to solve a problem automatically, taking it out of the hands of the farmer, that's great as long as your solution always works and keeps working. But what if your solution stops working? Now might not the farmer be in a worse situation than they were to begin with? And these things do stop working. The two technologies that completely dominate the world of GM crops are insect resistance and herbicide tolerance. And the insect resistance comes from putting in a Bt gene, and for a while it makes it so that it will kill certain categories of bugs that eat the plants. But the bugs always are going to develop resistance. And in fact, that's happened in several places in the world now, and it's happened in India. And we're now starting to get the first signs of resistance. And that's been the people to announce it, in fact, were Monsanto. They said we're starting to get resistance. And so Monsanto's solution to that is, no problem. When resistance comes along, we've got wonderful things in the pipeline. We'll have another genetically modified plant to back that one up, to replace that one next year. And when that one stops working, we've got another one after that. And so from their standpoint, I could understand that it looks like a winner, it's going to be a moneymaker, and from their mindset, it's an exciting thing. They're out there solving farmers' problems. But from the farmer's standpoint, a lot of the problems they're solving were the ones that Monsanto created in the first place. The farmers end up being on a treadmill. And so their own ability to deal with those bugs, whether it's by shaking them off like you were talking about, or by using all sorts of other low-tech solutions, they tend to lose those abilities. And they're now beholden to the company to come out with yet another technology. So the farmers in India now are on what they call the pesticide treadmill. And the claim is that they're just going to trade in the pesticide treadmill for the genetic treadmill. From my observations there, they're now on both treadmills. They still have to keep using insecticides, and they're also becoming increasingly reliant on genes. And as the genetic technologies lose effectiveness, then they're reliant on a new genetic technology. So they're now on two treadmills.
So the traditional ways of managing crops, managing pests, managing disease, increasing yields get lost. The technologies that are brought in to solve the same problems are basically opaque, perhaps to the people, even to the people who produced them, certainly to the users, and given the extent of change, they'll stay opaque forever. Nobody is going to catch up with the crops that are changing every year and the technologies that are changing every year. So there'll always be there'll always be dumb farmers, as people used to say disparagingly about the folks I grew up with who weren't dumb farmers at all. This sounds, from this side of the camera, it sounds A, damnable, and B, inevitable. One of those avalanches one watches starting in the mountain up there and realizes it's going to be at your ski lodge in about 5 minutes, and about all you can do is think of whether you remember a prayer or not. Is that the case? I'm actually fairly hopeful about agriculture in a lot of places. Now, in India, I'm just not sure. I just can't see the future at all in India. But in terms of what you're saying, in the U.S., I am really quite interested in the surge
of interest in new kinds of agriculture. And there's not even a proper word for it. Sometimes it's called New American Farming, but it's not just, part of it's organic farmers, but it's not just organic. Part of it is small scale. Part of it is direct marketing. It's the farmers that show up and sell their things in the local markets. Part of it is humanely raised. It's the farmers who want to have their chickens and pigs and cows raised humanely as opposed to in, in CAFOs, so on and so forth. So one of the things that is essential in this sort of new American farming is that the skill, farmer skill, has to come back into it. If we go back to what I was saying a minute ago about how my initial interest in agriculture got sparked by working with this anthropologist named Robert Netting, who was a scholar of small farms, and he was trying to tackle the big question of what makes sustainable farms actually work. And a big part of his answer, which I think was just right on the money, was skill. Skill is an absolutely essential part of sustainable farming. And so as you get more and more corporate technologies that are involved in your farming, more and more of the skill becomes a matter of just picking out the technology and just which product are you going to buy. But with a lot of these small farms, there's less and less reliance on external technology. It's not that external technology is totally eliminated, but more and more of the key driver of producing comes from farmer skill. And so if you go to your local farmer's market or you buy organic produce and so on, you're probably doing more than just avoiding pesticides, and you're probably doing more than just voting for a more humane way of raising animals. You're probably voting with your dollars for a return to a more skill-oriented farming. And so I agree with you. I see an avalanche coming down the hill, but I don't see it as being an avalanche that's going to sweep us all away. And I see a lot of the interest, certainly in the U.S., in alternative farming as being, maybe giving us some oases that are going to stay protected as that avalanche comes down.
Now, my understanding about the U.S. situation is that the oases, some of the major oases have been protected. Oases? I never know. Well,
I think it's oases.
Protected by religious fences. That is, the Amish preserve a traditional kind of farming and some skills involved because for religious reasons they reject a certain engagement with contemporary mechanized agriculture. I take it the Hutterites have something like that idea. The Shakers, in their own, tremendously inventive way, were also opting out for reasons of principle. I'm wondering if you see fences like that arising, any new fences like that arise?
Well, I see a lot of new farms springing up, and I see them figuring out as they go how to make them work. The fence metaphor breaks down because it's not a matter of, well, let me back up. Most farmers throughout history have grown up in a farming environment. Most farmers throughout history, the overwhelming majority of them have had their parents were farmers. And as they were growing up, they learned much of what they needed to know in order to run the farm. Now, that's not to say that each new generation does it the same way. They certainly tweak it, and we need to go into X and Y, but but we're going to keep doing Z. Still, even after they tweak it and change direction a little bit, a tremendous amount of what the basic knowledge, the basic skill of how to make the farm operate came down to them from their parents and from their culture. And so with the Amish, with the Mennonites, you've got a lot of that going on. Off the out of the Amish areas, you've got all of these new American farmers. And for them, it's not a fenced-in area where they didn't learn it from their parents for the most part, and they almost never learn it from their neighbors. I've found it's really rare to have one of these new American farms that's right next to another new American farm. The typical, grass-raised beef producer is right next to a conventional producer who's just sending the cows off to CAFOs. And the typical organic producer is right next to a conventional producer. So it's not just from the culture right around them. So it's not fenced. The information comes from all sorts of places. And that's actually, I think, one of the big problems that these farmers face is figuring out, how do we do it? Where do we get the information we need to make this farm work? And there's a learning curve, and these small farmers pay a heavy penalty as they're climbing up that learning curve. If they could just start, if they could go out and buy their farm out in the country and start up their grass-raised beef or their pastured lamb or their organic vegetables and have the thing be up and running the first year, then a lot more of them would be much more prosperous and would be able to stay in business a lot longer. So they're feeling their way through it, and it's I think it's one of the areas where I would love to, this is not going to happen, but I would love to see the USDA putting more resources into trying to promote the small farms and provide the resources that they need to try to figure out how to make it work.
Now, do you see a university role in this? I mean, I'm going to have supper tonight with a bunch of horticulture students from the University of Minnesota. Bunches of them want to start their own CSAs. They're going to travel around, get some information, see what people are doing, and then find a little piece of land and try to make a go of it on the principles they care about. Some of the most admirable people I know. Are the universities making a contribution to educating people in such a way that they can farm on a non-corporate, non-industrial model?
Yeah, they're starting to, and it's being driven by the young people. Because, and there are a handful of people on faculties that are really interested in this, but they tend to be pretty small because most of the money, most of the funding is for things that are more related to large-scale industrial commodity production. But the younger, the students tend to be very interested in this. Our students at Washington University started their own campus farm about 5 years ago. And the interesting thing about their campus farm is it's one of over 90 campus farms on campuses now, and almost the great majority of them has sprung up in the past 5 to 10 years. And there is at our caterer at Washington University, there's what they call a farm to fork program. And that was driven mainly by interest on the part of the students, and it's one of over 100 farm to fork programs on campuses. So the young people are the big driving force behind this. And there was an interesting book that came out a few years ago on sustainability movements on campus, edited by anthropologist Peggy Barlett, that goes through a lot of these things that are going on campus. It's actually really big. And my hat's off to the younger generation because they're the ones who are really pushing it.
How about the role specifically of anthropologists in this business? I mean, along the line, documenting what's happening, I would think lost in the field notes are a bunch of pretty interesting technologies. I mean, the technologies that have been recorded for rice farming, for example, small-scale rice farming, for small-scale beef operations. I know from my own experience just how endlessly varied these things are. So my question is anybody in anthropology, including yourself, taking seriously the idea of preserving some of this stuff, not just sort of as an academic curiosity, but as something that should be fed to the horticulture department?
It's an interesting question. I think to the extent that anthropologists had that sort of information, the place to take it would not be the horticulture department. It would be to take it straight to the farmers. And there's no mechanism to do that now. But one could certainly generate a mechanism. One could start a little organization or a website or something like that. I think that the role that anthropologists could play, and they're certainly not playing this right now, it is not to tell small farmers what works, but simply to provide information about technologies and let them sift through it. So it's just to broaden the range of ideas and the range of techniques. But I think that there could definitely be some value in that. Or if not so much a matter of just getting older techniques and bringing them to the attention of farmers, but just helping move information around among contemporary farmers. Because there's no good mechanism for that right now. So I go and interview a farmer, say, in Nelson County, Virginia, which I did recently, and said, how did you, get started up? She's doing grass-fed beef. And so the question is, how did you figure out how to do this? And when she first bought the farm, one of the first things that she did was to go around and interview some other people in the area that did grass-raised beef. But it's only convenient for her to get to 3 or 4 other people. And if she had had some way of getting access to information on what 20 or 30 other small grass beef producers in that part of the world were doing, that would have been much more valuable. So I think there's potential there for us to be able to move information around. There's a model that's worth thinking about. There's a professor in India, in Gujarat, who has started something called the Honeybee Network. And the metaphor here is that honeybees go from flower to flower and pollinate by moving things. And so his idea was to and he is not just interested in agriculture, he's interested in all sorts of indigenous innovation. But what he does is he gets information about who's innovating what sorts of simple technologies, whether it's in weaving, whether it's in farming, so on and so forth, and then centralizes and helps disseminate that information. And so that would be a fun thing to look into. But to answer your question, no, anthropologists aren't doing that. But I hope to at least, within a few years, be able to have some concrete suggestions to make about how technological changes could best be promoted to help small farmers.
So you see yourself as, dare I say, something like a service anthropologist?
I think that the research on small farms that I'm starting up has got the potential to actually be a service, which is not something I would say about most research that most anthropologists do, and not something I'd say about other research that I've done. And that's a point of some shame for a lot of us. I mean, when I started showing up in India and talking with these farmers, they didn't really understand what an anthropologist was all about, but they knew I knew something about agriculture. And so the first thing they wanted to know is, do you have a new pesticide for me? That's the main thing I need. And my answer was, no, I'm sorry, I don't have pesticides. Okay, well, can you tell me how to deal with this bug situation? And I don't know how to deal with a bug situation. I would immediately start to feel pretty bad that I can't tell them how to do anything. I'm just here to try to figure out how their farm works. And to them, I'm largely useless. And some anthropologists, I think it makes them feel good to convince themselves that they're really helping the people they study. And in some cases, that probably is true, but usually it isn't. And I'm willing to man up and say that most of my research has not been of direct benefit to the people I've studied. Although I admire them a lot, and I would really like to be able to do something to benefit for them. With the small farmers, I'm optimistic, because my whole approach to this is I'm asking academic questions, but they're also practical service questions. I want to say, what is it that makes small farms not work when they don't work? What could make them work better? What are the obstacles to these farms being sustainable and productive? So maybe I'll talk to you in a couple of years and I'll be able to tell you something more concrete about how it actually has been of some service.
Thanks for your time.